It's like if self-titled was like Spicy Easy Mac, then Scrolls of the Megilloth was like beef stroganoff, but like without any noodles and only beef and like cooked in one of hell's ovens. Hello, and welcome back to DFT'S Dungeon. My name is Daniel Terry, and last week I made a poll here on YouTube asking you guys to pick the next band that I talk about on my original trilogy series. And you guys ended up picking Mortification over Tourniquet, which kind of surprised me if I'm being honest. I mean, I would have to say that I'm something of a casual Mortification fan. But I'm sure I could come up with a few facts that you guys might find interesting when it comes to early Mortification. So grab yourself a snack and settle in as we explore the early history of one of the most influential bands to ever combine biblical lyrics with guttural death metal. So it's impossible to talk about Mortification without talking about the band's frontman and bass player, Steve Rowe. And believe me when I tell you that nobody knows as much about the early history of heavy metal as Steve Rowe. Growing up in Australia in the 1970s and 1980s, Steve was introduced to hard rock and heavy metal at the young age of 8 years old. And he grew up with all of the classic bands, including bands like Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, AC/DC, Judas Priest, breaking the law, breaking the law, breaking the law, breaking the law, Iron Maiden, and Motorhead. And what was probably most relatable about Steve is that he grew up in a strict Christian household, just like I did. And probably like a lot of you guys that are watching this. And so we all know that frustration of listening to music that your parents hate and having to fight that battle almost every time they catch you listening to anything that isn't worship music or hymns. And it was this fascination with hard rock and heavy metal that led Steve away from his local church and into a lifestyle of partying with people who shared his same love for music. However, all of this would change in 1983 and 1984 when Steve was introduced to Resurrection Band and their album Mommy Don't Love Daddy Anymore by a friend from his church. And this album seemed to have awakened something in Steve due to the novelty of having a band that played the kind of music that he liked but better reconciled with his spiritual beliefs. And this is such an interesting thing to think about now in 2024. Like, obviously, the idea of Christian metal has been around for a long time. You can likely find Christian bands in any style of extreme metal and rock. Really, like, anything that you're into, there's probably dozens of Christian bands playing that style. But in 1984, that just wasn't the case. Like, sure, there was Christian hard rock and metal, but there wasn't a lot of it to choose from. Now, this is just me taking a wild guess here, but I would imagine that there were probably less than like 30 Christian metal and hard rock bands active at that time. But this album by Resurrection Band not only inspired Steve to start going to church again, but also planted the idea in his head that he needed to seek out other Christian musicians and form his own band. And that is exactly what he did, twice. After switching to a church that did outreach with metalheads and punk rockers, this gave Steve no shortage of fellow musicians to jam with, and he was finally able to start his own band. And this band, despite hitting some false starts and some roadblocks in the beginning, would eventually become the band Lightforce in 1985-1986. Now, Lightforce was more of a traditional heavy metal band, but very contemporary for the time. But like a lot of metal fans at that time, Steve had started developing a taste for music that was just a little bit heavier, and started getting into genres like thrash metal, death metal, and grindcore. He even tried incorporating some of those elements into the Lightforce sound, and Lightforce would eventually go on to record 2 albums called Battlezone and Mystical Thieves. Unfortunately, as the band was gaining popularity, some members of the band left, which prompted Steve to pitch the idea of making the band heavier and to have him on vocals. and the remaining band members really weren't into that idea so much. But as we're going to find out as I do, not just this video on Mortification, but probably several others in the future, Steve Rowe's not the kind of guy that just gets a bad outcome and just gives up. Instead, he decided to just reform the band with a new lineup. And the reformed Lightforce had Cameron Hall on guitar and superhuman cosmic rhythm machine Jason Sherlock on drums. And they even recorded a demo under the name of Lightforce. But the band felt like because they had more of a new direction, which was leaning a lot closer to thrash metal with growled vocals, they finally decided to give the band a more appropriate name, which was Mortification. Now, as much as I'm sure that you guys would like for me to start talking about the self-titled Mortification album, I have to talk about the demo that the band recorded under the Lightforce name first. That demo being called Break the Curse. Now, I'm not totally sure if Break the Curse was ever supposed to be officially released. I think at the time, they were just using it as a demo that they could send to record labels to see if somebody maybe wanted to sign the band. But thankfully, it did get released later on down the line by Nuclear Blast, and then later it was released by Rowe Productions, which was Steve's label. And the reason I want to talk about it is because it's a really cool glimpse at the origin of a great band. And now I don't have the tape, but I don't think anybody has the tape, so this time I'm not going to beg somebody to send me the tape. But I can say from the CD version that I have, the Break the Curse actually sounds really, really good for a demo. Those everything sounds kind of thin, but it really reinforces that underground thrash metal vibe that the band was going for. And I actually really love Steve's vocals on this demo, as they're straight up growled and raspy, similar to something that you would hear from Carcass. Just really, really raw, and almost more raw than the music probably called for, but I'm into it. But if you haven't heard Break the Curse before, it's really cool to hear alternate versions of the songs that would eventually end up on the self-titled album. It's also worth noting that Cameron Hall left the band sometime between Break the Curse and self-titled, and I wasn't really able to figure out exactly when or why, but he was replaced fairly quickly by Michael Carlisle, and it is his guitar that we hear on the self-titled debut. Speaking of the self-titled, where Break the Curse gave us a glimpse of what was to come, let me just say that the jump between the demo and the actual full length was absolutely massive. Right from the get-go, you are assaulted with piercing thrash riffs that sometimes like to devolve into these noisy walls of guitar noise. Couple that with Jason Sherlock's double kick assault, and Mortification has already established themselves as a force to be reckoned with. But then, oh man, Steve's vocals kick in, and the sheer terror and extremity of what is going on will eventually overload your senses. I mean, to be fair, that's probably how you would have felt in 1991 when this thing first hit store shelves. Now, if you're buying this on Christian store shelves, then you might have got the lame cover, which is just a black cover with the Mortification logo on it. But if you're lucky enough to get the gnarly cover that was drawn by Jason Sherlock, then you truly had the full package. The album was actually released in the Christian market under Intense Records, and in the secular market under Nuclear Blast Records, which I have a really funny story about that when we get to Post Momentary Affliction. But the gnarly cover features a hellish lake of damned souls under a cloudy sky, and the band's brutal logo of 3 crosses complete with skulls. This album cover honestly looks exactly how this album sounds. And when I was younger, I used to tell people that this was like, the first Christian death metal album ever, man, which is technically not true on both counts. While it's easy to look at the cover and hear Steve's absolutely terrifying vocals over double bass drumming and heavy riffs, this record still maintains enough thrash metal writing and technique to firmly cement it as still a thrash record. That said, back in 1991, we didn't really categorize bands with an Excel spreadsheet like we do now, so it was certainly a transitionary record between thrash and death metal. But I would say that if you're a fan of either, this record certainly gets the job done. But the other thing I was wrong about was it being the first, as Human Sacrifice by Vengeance Rising predated predates Mortification's debut by about 3 years. But, controversial statement here, while I appreciate the historical significance of Vengeance Rising, I'm sorry, I just like Mortification more. And it might just be because I heard Mortification first and these songs are just sort of imprinted into my brain. And that's my favorite thing about these early Mortification albums, actually, is how much the songs have kind of stuck with me over the years. Even here on their debut, it's notable how catchy the songs actually are when you're considering the extremity of the music itself. I mean, you're going a million miles an hour, and this dude is just like vomiting into a microphone, and yet it sticks with you. Because despite lacking any clean singing in any capacity, the grunts and growls and snarls always have a catchy and memorable hook to them. Songs like Brutal Warfare, Satan's Doom, The Destroyer Beholds, and Journey of Reconciliation are chocked full of earworms. The only songs where they deviate from that focus is on the two shorter, kind of grindcore-ish songs, Turn and The Majestic Infiltration of Order, or as it's more commonly known, God Rules, which are both, about a minute long each, which I'm sure was Steve's way of making sure that the album got the coveted grindcore tag on it. Taken as a whole, Mortification's self-titled debut firmly establishes their mastery of extreme metal and cemented them as one of the hottest new bands in the emerging Christian death metal scene at the time. And as much as I love it, the only negative thing I can really say about it is that these songs are so good that I wish they were recorded a little bit better. Like, this sounds better than the demo, but the guitars and drums, while excellently performed, they kind of lack the punch that they should have had from this kind of band. And I've listened to the original and remastered versions a bunch of times, and even though, it sounds awesome in an underground metal kind of way, I just want to hear these songs hit harder than they do here. And an interesting side note is that this album was produced by Roger Martinez of Vengeance Rising.
Didn't do a very good job.
Any complaints aside, though, this was an absolute powerhouse of a debut album for the band, and as hard as this might be to believe, they're actually holding back a little bit on this one, because just like in my last video about Living Sacrifice, the real brutality had yet to come, because in December of 1991, Mortification stepped into Studio RBX in Melbourne, Australia, to record what many fans would describe as their finest work to this day, Scrolls of the Megilloth. It's hard to use words to describe just how much of a leap forward and extremity and heaviness that this album was for the band. It's like if self-titled was like spicy Easy Mac, then Scrolls of the Megilloth was like beef stroganoff, but like without any noodles and only beef and like cooked in one of hell's ovens. This is one of the only Mortification albums that sticks mostly to one style throughout, and that style is grade A old school death metal, or as they called it in 1992, just death metal. The boys in Mortification were definitely listening to some Bolt Thrower and Carcass leading up to this monster of a record. It contains fast and ferocious down-tuned riffs, blast beats for days, and Steve Rowe's grind baritone of extreme reality. No, I'm serious. That's what it actually says in the album credits. Michael Carlisle's guitar tone on this record is really grindy and dingy sounding, to the point where it sounds kind of similar to something that you'd hear on an early Entombed album. And it makes me wonder if this album is the reason why I took to early Swedish death metal as quickly as I did. It's like literally my favorite kind of death metal. And Scrolls doesn't sound exactly the same as like the Swedish buzzsaw, but it gives very similar vibes. And full disclosure, I'm not a guitar player, so I apologize if I'm not like describing stuff like tones correctly. But Steve Rowe's bass tone is really unique on this album too, because most of the time when I'm listening to death metal, I don't really hear the bass at all because the guitars tend to eat up a lot of that low end. But on Scrolls, Steve makes an active effort for his instrument to be heard. And get used to that, because that would go on to define the Mortification sound going forward. But I can't overstate the impact of Steve's absolutely terrifying vocals on this album. The vocals make good use of multi-tracking techniques, sometimes mixing in like higher pitched growling sounds, or just doubling up on Steve's ultra guttural vocals, which he uses for pretty much the whole album. And something that I love about Scrolls is that despite this being like basically the heaviest music I'd ever heard the first time I heard it, is that it still holds a lot of focus on hooky and catchy riffing and vocals. Like the song Scrolls of the Megilloth has like a full-on verse, chorus, verse structure to it, which makes it one of the catchiest death metal songs that I've ever heard.
Scrolls of the Megilloth. Scrolls of the Megilloth.
And some of my other favorite songs include Terminate Damnation, with those synced up high and low vocals in the beginning. Ancient Prophecy is like a 10-minute doom metal song with these like wild pitch-shifted vocals in the middle that gave me nightmares when I was a teenager. Death Requiem has this creepy voice narrating at a funeral. I think it's Jason Sherlock that's doing the narrating, but he's very creepy here.
We come together to mourn a relative.
And Eternal Lamentation wins the most evil sounding song award because it mixes in like the flames of hell and then like people screaming as they burn in the flames. I'm not exactly sure how they got a sample from actual hell, but hats off to the guys. It definitely has the desired effect. It was so strange listening to Scrolls the first time I heard it because I had actually gotten into Mortification much later in their career. The first Mortification albums I ever heard were Triumph of Mercy and Hammer of God, so by the time I ended up getting this, I wasn't like adequately prepared for how heavy it was going to be, and I don't think I really got it the first time I heard it. But for some reason, I just kept listening because of the way it like freaked people out that were around me when I was listening to it. One time whenever I was in high school, I was like really interested in this girl, and she actually agreed to come over to my house to hang out for the first time, which was a big deal. It was really cool. And we got to talking about music, and she asked me a very fateful question, which was, what was the last CD that I had bought? And unfortunately for her, or for me, depending on how you want to look at it, the last CD that I bought was Scrolls of the Megilloth. And I absolutely could not resist the urge to see how she was going to react to it. So I put the CD in my CD player, and I load up Necromanicide. And I want to say we got about 45 seconds into Necromanicide, and I looked over at her, and she's just like not really reacting at all, just like total blank stare. And then like real suddenly she like jerks her head to the side and looks at me and goes, "Can I use your bathroom?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure." And then she walked out of my bedroom, down the hall, down the stairs, out the front door, and then walked down the street where I assume she called somebody to pick her up because she did not talk to me after that. Now, you might think that that was a dumb strategy to attract women, but like in my defense, the next girl that I tried that on did end up marrying me. So I would say that it had about a 50% success rate. But anyway, I became obsessed with Scrolls for a long time. And for a long time, I mean, I'm like still pretty obsessed with Scrolls. And I also think that this was the first album where I really started to notice drums. Like, of course, I knew what drums were before that, but I mean, like, this was one of the first albums where I was almost paying more attention to what was going on with the drums than the rest of the music. Jason Sherlock is probably the best drummer that I listen to, and I will always go out of my way to hear anything that he plays on. More about Jason a little bit later in this video. And I've reviewed a lot of death metal in the years since then, but there's always some small part of me that holds Scrolls up as like a golden standard that I compare all of the other death metal that I hear to. It's an absolute classic, and it's still in my regular rotation today. And sometime after Scrolls, the band recorded an unreleased song called Butchered Mutilation, which I first actually heard in MP3 format off of this like crappy old like Mortification fan site. Because for the longest time, the only way you could get it was as a bonus track on the Nuclear Blast re-release of Break the Curse. But man, Butchered Mutilation is a top-tier Mortification song. It's like the perfect transitionary song between this album and the next one. And speaking of the next one, now it has to be a pretty daunting task to release a perfect album as it is, but I think the harder task is figuring out how to follow up on that record. And I think Steve Rowe put a lot of thought into the fact that death metal was getting really popular and trendy at the time. And I know not like popular in like the mainstream sense, but just like that a lot of the bands that Mortification was inspired by, or bands that they played with and stuff, everybody was kind of like underground bands were jumping on the death metal train, right? And the problem with that, though, is that Mortification's purpose as a band has always been to bring people to God through heavy music, and not specifically just fans of death metal. And I think Steve was a little bit worried about being pigeonholed as a death metal band after Scrolls, and I think that it was with that mindset that the band stepped into Toy Box Studios in 1993 to record their third album, Post Momentary Affliction. And as soon as this record starts off, you can tell something's different about the approach. The first track, Illusions from the Valley of Darkness, is like a 47-second intro track that just has a bunch of like random noise thrown together. Like there's like a lot of wind and just like weird like computerized sound. And then like out of nowhere, suddenly you hear Steve growling like, "From the Valley of the Shadows," and then you just hear glass shattering and like a woman breathing really heavily, and it's like really, really bizarre and really weird. But it definitely sets the mood that the band was going for. That little intro track then transitions into the first proper song, which is called From the Valley of the Shadows.
What is truth? I ask myself.
And it's here that you realize that Mortification is sort of swung backwards a little bit to their thrash sound from the self-titled. Except for the fact that this album is like leaps and bounds better than the self-titled in the recording department. The songs are still catchy and they're still earworms, but you start noticing that the album has a much more dedicated focus to slower and more epic sounding riffs. From the Valley of the Shadows alone is a big mix of like death metal, thrash, and even some more slower doom metal style riffs. Steve's vocals are also dialed back from the, Scrolls baritone sound, and they're replaced with this growly shout that is pretty similar to his vocals on Self-Titled and Break the Curse, with some like weird clean shouting, like old punk shouts that are just thrown into the mix. And Jason's drumming, obviously, is as solid as ever on this album, but it is also notably dialed back from Scrolls. The songs are longer, and they've got a lot more moving parts. And it's not exactly like technical, but it's more complex than the previous two albums. And it's night and day different than Scrolls. But you know what? It works. And I enjoy it quite a bit. It's cool to hear the band experimenting, but they still leave enough of the thrash and death metal and grindcore sound in there to keep fans of the band hooked, right? Like, if you liked the earlier albums, you're not going to listen to this album and be like, "Oh my God, that is total trash," right? Songs like Distarnished Priest with its slow and doomy, growly opening is awesome. Grind Planetarium has this really, really catchy chorus. Overseer is just like an awesome death metal Mortification track with like a little bit of groove to it. And Vital Fluids just goes like basically full grindcore for like 6 minutes straight, which is pretty awesome. And those are probably, like, to this day, some of my favorite Mortification songs. Because what Mortification did on Post Momentary Affliction was create an extreme metal album that was accessible to, like, anybody who would have been into metal at the time. And I'm just guessing here, but I would assume that it vastly expanded their fan base. Even though I'm sure there were probably some fans that were bummed out that this wasn't Scrolls Part 2. But overall, it's another solid classic from Mortification. And the only thing that I don't love about it is the instrumental song Flight of Victory, which starts off kind of cool and then goes completely bananas. It's totally out of nowhere, and it doesn't really fit with the vibe of this album at all. It's a song that like very much baffles me to this day, and I'm not entirely sure why it's on the album. Now, the original version of Post Momentary Affliction that I got was a cassette version of the Nuclear Blast release, which had an alternate cover. The original cover was drawn by Jason Sherlock, and it really captures that like otherworldly vibe that the album was going for. And even though I think that cover looks really, really cool, I actually prefer the random Nuclear Blast cover. Because I don't know, like I like the purple sky and the decaying buildings. I was confused though when I was reading the J card of the cassette, because Steve is like explaining the cover art and the cover of my tape didn't look anything like he was describing. And it's also worth noting that this tape had the words Nuclear Blast America printed in huge letters on the tape, which my dad really gave me the side eye whenever he saw that. He was like, Nuclear Blast America. What kind of crap are you listening to? And I was like, geez, Dad, it's just Christian death metal. Why don't you get cool? I never did end up getting a CD copy of the Nuclear Blast cover of Post Momentary. I have the Intense Records version on CD, and I recently picked up the remastered edition, but both of them have the original cover art, which, I mean, it should be that way. But I probably need to get on Discogs and finally get that Nuclear Blast version. The closest thing I have is this like German digipack release that is like a double release of Scrolls and Post Momentary. So like at least I have like half of the cover that I like. But all in all, Post Momentary Affliction is the perfect ending to a trilogy because it incorporates all the best elements from the other two parts and leaves us feeling like we've really come full circle. And most of the time, when I'm in the mood for some mortification, I'll just listen to all three of these classics back to back. And another cool way to listen to some of these songs, though, is to check out the Live Planetarium album that they released right after Post Momentary. It's an amazing live show where they play songs from all three of these albums. And I might be remembering this wrong, but I think this was actually Jason Sherlock's last show with the band. Jason would leave the band in 1993 to join the death doom band Paramecium, where his drumming slowed down considerably in tempo, but not so much in intensity. Let me know if you ever want a Paramecium episode on the show. In 1994, Jason went into a studio and recorded what might just be the very first Christian black metal or unblack metal album called Heilig Usvart under the name of Horde. And I'm just going to be straight up, I'm probably not going to do a Horde video, but you never know. Wait, you know what? How about this? If 5 new people sign up for my Patreon within like 1 month of me releasing this video, I will make a Horde video. Like, I don't even care. I'll talk about, I can definitely talk about Horde for 30 minutes. As for Steve and Michael, well, they just kept on trucking with Mortification and started working on an album that would stray even further from the established sound of the first 3 Mortification albums. And as for me, I discovered Mortification back when I was in high school, and I was definitely more acquainted with their later catalog. But going back through their discography to the beginning was a really magical experience for me. It kind of became an obsession of mine to collect everything that they ever made. Even though I may not think of some of their later material in like very high esteem as like these first 3 albums, they left such a profound impact on me that they made me a lifetime fan, hell or high water. The story of Mortification is interesting because of the nature of how they started and how long they were around. And it all started with a guy in his basement listening to metal and thinking, you know what, I can do that. Not content to just stand by and be a fan. Steve saw an opportunity to make something cool and new, and he took it. He's an inspiration to me and so many other creative people out there. Now, obviously, Mortification has like a bunch of albums after this, so don't expect this to be the only video that I ever make on the band. Let me know in the comments what your favorite era of Mortification is and what your favorite Mortification album is. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching this video to the end. It means a lot that you guys find this stuff as interesting as I do. If you guys liked this video, please make sure to give it a like. And if you like the channel, please subscribe to it so you don't miss new videos when they come out. Other than that, that's all I've got for you guys this week. I'll see you guys next time.